Look, people. Hi, people. So two men, Hyman and Itzik, moderately proficient in Yiddish, are discussing the challenge of translation. Says Hyman, there are Yiddish expressions that don't translate well into English, and so many English words that aren't easy translated into Yiddish. For example, says Itzik, well, says Hyman, I have difficulty finding a Yiddish word that adequately conveys the concept of the English word disappointed. Good point, replies his friend. You know, my mother speaks only Yiddish. I'll find out from her how to say disappointed. So Itzik goes home to his mother's house and says, Mama, you know that I always come for Shabbos dinner on Friday nights. How would you feel if one Friday I called and said that I wouldn't be coming over for Shabbos? His mother replies, Oi, ich will sein sehr disappointed. So I find it a bit challenging at this moment to convey our collective sense of disappointment. This is our new year, a solemn but joyous occasion in our stunning historic building on the precipice of its 100th birthday. This sanctuary was made all the more beautiful and comfortable just recently through your collective generosity. This room should be filled to capacity as it was 2 years ago, or a little closer even to half capacity as we thought it would be just a couple of months ago. I know many of you who are joining us virtually very much wanted to be here in person. So how do we translate the disappointment that many of us are feeling into a meaningful Rosh Hashanah observance, even a joyous New Year's celebration? It's one thing to endure a global pandemic for a few months, even a year perhaps, but at this point, the weight of it can start to feel a little overwhelming, doesn't it? The psalmist writes, I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind. I am like a lost vessel, kichli oved. Rashi explains a vessel that has been lost for more than 12 months is forgotten by its owners because they despair of finding it after that time. My friends, we in this moment run a real risk of giving in to despair. There's a beautiful and haunting midrash that explains why our matriarch Sarah's death occurs in the passage just after the Akedah, the binding of her son Isaac that we'll read about tomorrow. Rashi puts it this way, because as a result of the news of the binding that her son was prepared for slaughter and was almost killed, her soul flew out of her and she died. Gur Aryeh, the 16th century Maharal of Prague, adds, it seems that because Sarah heard that Isaac was almost slaughtered, that just a small thing kept him from being slaughtered, for this reason she was shocked, nivhala. This is the way of humanity, he writes, to be shocked upon hearing that only a small thing kept one alive. Today on this Rosh Hashanah, at the head of this new year, I want to talk about coming home. This is our theme for 5782, and we, the clergy, the staff, the officers and trustees of Beth Am are excited for the possibilities of the coming year, but it must be acknowledged that when we initially chose this theme, we thought more of the physical in-person coming home to here to Utah Place would be sooner and a bit more linear. And now it appears to be slower and a little bit more iterative. But then, we always knew that it would be a process, that we'd be coming home, not simply arriving all at once together. We just thought, I had hoped, at the High Holy Days, we would not feel so much like a lost vessel. Yet, this sermon was always going to be one about trauma. No doubt, whether our re-entry takes 3 months or 6 months or chas v'shalom another year or more, we who enter these walls or this streaming portal, we carry so much with us. We are not the same as we once were. We must name this so that we can move forward. We must own and share our collective grief at what's occurred. Sarah, lonely and grieving what might have been, was not so lucky to have what I think we have. The consequences in her case were catastrophic. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, a contemporary scholar who lives in Jerusalem, takes Gur Aryeh's comments, Lefichach nivhala, that Sarah was shocked, one step further. One could say something like shock, but nivhal is not exactly shock. Nivhal is something like dizziness. It's vertigo. It's not knowing where one is, a shock in the sense of a loss of orientation. I don't know at all where I am in the world. Gur Aryeh says that this is a universal thing. It's a very common reaction to a situation in which, she writes, is almost. It's a sense of theological vertigo, of asking, what does anything mean in that case? If it's really just a millimeter, it could go this way, it could go that way. How do we understand God's providence? How do we understand anything in view of such events? The Gur Aryeh, Zornberg writes, indicates that Sarah dies of something like this. She does not die thinking that Isaac is dead. She knows he's alive, but only by a hair's breadth. And that immediately sets everything awry, does something radical to her sense of order and coherence in the world. The tragic paradox is that Sarah, mother of a nation, feels so betrayed by her husband with whom she brought this boy into the world at such an advanced age, by her God who promised progeny and legacy and then leaves her in a world of theological vertigo. She feels so disillusioned by the almost, that she doesn't have the tools to bear it. Sarah dies of a broken heart. Today I want to touch on some of those tools, because now we need them more than ever. Bruce Perry, a child psychiatrist and neuroscientist, suggests that surviving, even thriving after trauma, requires an understanding of how trauma works. For example, people often talk about wanting to raise resilient children, but what do we mean by this, he asks. He gives the example of a Nerf ball. If you take a Nerf ball and you squeeze it, you apply all kinds of force to it, it will, in the end, return to its original ball-like shape. The Nerf ball is resilient. This is the kind of resilience people are talking about when they talk about children being resilient in the wake of trauma, says Perry. They're indulging in the wishful thinking that a traumatic stress and somehow magically be unaffected, as though the child would be able to return to their prior level of emotional, physical, social, cognitive health unchanged. But that is simply not the way that it works, he says. We are always changing, all of us. We change from all of our experiences, good and bad. He argues that life after traumatic experiences is not about getting over the experience, but living with it, locating it within ourselves so that it does not dominate our sense of being. About learning to ask not what's wrong with me, but what happened to me? This pandemic, my friends, has happened to us. It's happening to us. And it's painful, and it's anxiety-provoking, and it's lonely. Some of us have contracted the virus. Some of us have lost loved ones. All of us have had our lives utterly transformed by it. It's not just COVID, is it? It's raging wildfires, and it's flash flooding, and it's record heat waves and hurricanes. It's millions of climate refugees around the world. It's injustice at home. It's concern for the situation in Israel. It's terror around the globe. "20 years ago, this coming Shabbat, that terror came to our shores and precipitated a war that ended last week, but whose impact is far from over. Any of us who are alive know exactly where we were on that Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001. Any of us who were born or became aware since then have grown up in a changed world. But the tools of salvation can be found, maybe even forged, in the fires of destruction. You may know of the massive evacuation at Dunkirk during World War II. Did you know there was a bigger one? The largest boat rescue in world history happened 20 years ago this week. As the chaos unfolded in New York, as the Twin Towers fell, thousands of people fled south to lower Manhattan, seeking refuge from the flames of the once towering infernos. And when they reached the Hudson River, they had nowhere to go, and they began to panic. The Coast Guard simply didn't have the resources to rescue such a large number of people in time, so they did something unprecedented. They issued a radio call for civilian vessels to help. And help they did. Over the next 9 hours, hundreds of boats ferried frightened, soot-covered passengers to safety. Those civilian boats were the staff that split the sea of the Hudson River and delivered 500,000 human beings to safety. The best tool for combating terror is the same as that for overcoming loneliness and arriving to the other side of trauma. It's people dedicated to something greater than themselves. It's answering a call. It's transporting one another across the water. It's holding each other against the storm. It's healing together during and after the plague. It's coming home to a community of chesed, of mutual respect, and of love. I feel incredibly blessed to be a pulpit rabbi right now. Don't get me wrong, we've been working harder than we ever thought that we would or could. And it's super hard to dig deep and find the creativity and stamina to keep the shul going right now, but we are not alone, and so many of you have reached out to share your stories of heartache and recovery. I've stood but not danced at your weddings. I've Zoomed into your brisses and baby namings. We've welcomed the Shabbat Kala in Druid Hill Park and distributed food here in Reservoir Hill. You've sat with each other in backyards and on porches, and when it was safer, in restaurants and dining rooms. Our youth are finding new ways to learn. Our teachers, new ways to teach. Abby and I, and now Rav Tyler and I, have been beaming ourselves into your living rooms so that against this unlikely backdrop, we can continue as our new vision and values statement proclaims to joyfully explore life's journey in sacred fellowship. But I feel so blessed to be a pulpit rabbi right now, mostly because I know that our shul at its best can be a bulwark against loneliness. The isolation that so many of us are feeling during this time. Chevra, we are facing an epidemic of loneliness exacerbated by the pandemic of COVID. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, writes the following in his book, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. Isolation is considered a risk factor for loneliness simply because you're more likely to feel lonely if you rarely interact with others. Now, Dr. Murthy wrote his book before COVID, but it's certainly been resonant these past many months. His research makes a distinction, though, between what was once called oneliness and the term loneliness coined by Shakespeare in the 16th century. Oneliness is more akin to solitude, which is an important aspect of healthy living. And as you know, one can be quite lonely in a crowded room. It's not just about being together that helps, it's how we're being together and what we do together. Julianne Holt-Lundstad of BYU analyzed nearly 150 studies from around the world with the goal of answering the following question: do social relationships reduce our risk of dying early? Indeed, they do. Lack of social connection is, quote, equal in reducing lifespan to the risk of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and is greater than the risk associated with obesity, excess alcohol consumption, and lack of exercise. Would things have been different for Sarah if she had had people to turn to when the news of Isaac's near death arrived, or if Abraham and God had better considered the impact of her on their plot against her son? If we have no peace, said Mother Teresa, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. Our need for connection goes back to the earliest stages of our species development when we found strength in numbers. Murty explains we're biologically primed not just to feel better together, but to feel normal together. And we feel best when we're helping others together. That's why years after he wrote Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam made the point that it's better not just to join bowling leagues, but to join church bowling leagues. Perhaps he should have said synagogue bowling leagues, since Putnam himself is Jewish. The point is, our shul and other communities like ours are an effective defense against the scourge of loneliness and an affirmative choice for us to flourish as we move through this tough moment. I want to share one final thing then about coming home, because knowing this is a place worthy of coming home to is not enough. If we're doing this right, we need to be thoughtful about how we're coming home. What do we bring with us through these doors? If we're kissing the mezuzah on the way in, are we being careful? Our inner struggles goodbye? I surely do not have all the answers, but my gut tells me we must bring much of what we're carrying with us and resist the urge to leave the hard stuff, the heavy stuff, at home. The Talmud in Masechet Smachot, a minor tractate, supports this idea. On the first and second day of mourning, he may not enter the Temple Mount, says the Gemara. On the third day, he may enter, but must go around to the left, since he is forbidden to bring an offering. The Talmud wishes to honor the Torah's restrictions for those in mourning, but the fascinating thing is that mourners are not excluded from the place of central gathering. They simply have to enter differently. Most people enter to the right, and they walk counterclockwise. Interestingly, this is how Muslims circumambulate the Kaaba during the Hajj. But, says the Talmud, mourners go clockwise. They enter through the exit, and the text goes on, these are they who must go around to the left: a mourner, an excommunicated person, one who has a sick person in their house, and one who has lost an object. Why is this? Is this simply an accommodation out of guilt? Second-class access for the marginalized and bereft? On the contrary, the whole point is that people walking around this way from the right are meant to encounter those entering this way from the left. And as these people pass one another, they must interact. The people coming out from their normal worship ask, "Why are you coming from the left?" If one is a mourner, they say, "Hashochen babayit hazeh yinachemcha." May the one who dwells in this house bring you comfort. Now that's beautiful, but you might think that they comfort the mourner, but maybe snub the minudeh, the one who's been excommunicated. But no, they welcome that person too, and they pray for their full return. And those nursing sick loved ones are seen and supported. And to the one who has lost an object, they say, "May the one who dwells in this house put it into the heart of the finder to return it to you at once." What I love about this text is that it invites us to return to a place of holiness no matter our station. And it challenges us to see and hear and hold one another in our failure, our fear, and our pain. How many of us are grieving right now? come home. How many of us feel abandoned or excluded? Come home. If you're not quite healthy, stay home. But when you're not contagious or you're struggling to support a loved one, come home. If you've lost something precious, your livelihood, a relationship, time that ought to have been better spent, whatever you have lost, here you can be found. Come home. And come with the fullness of yourself, your interests and your passions. Come home to learning, tefillah, service, and building deeper relationships with our Reservoir Hill neighbors. This year of coming home to our newly renovated building, to our soon-to-be-built office complex, and our outdoor space also marks a return to Beth Am's core value of do-it-yourself, DIY. We need you to come home, because there is work to do, and our staff and our clergy continue to need your partnership, your ownership of this space. And as you pass through our doors, our actual doors, or for the time being, our portals made of ones and zeros, you need not kiss your trauma goodbye to kiss the mezuzah on the door. Come home with your theological vertigo or your abiding faith. Come home whether you remember how much this place feels like home, or whether you've begun, God forbid, to forget. And if you've recently joined our community, welcome home. Whether you enter to the right or to the left, and I suspect each of us will be doing some of both, come home. Chevra, we're in the business of creating sacred encounters. So as we come home, it makes sense to do something that adds holiness to this place. I've mentioned the mezuzah a couple of times now. Truth be told, there are numerous doors here in our building that require mezuzot, but we only have one mezuzah hanging, the one that Mark and Pat Joseph placed at our new Chauncey entrance 2 years ago. We had hoped to hang more sooner, but the pandemic slowed us down. Rav Tyler will have our young people do an inventory of doorways. We'll have an opportunity, multiple opportunities throughout the year to participate. Anyone who wants will have an opportunity to do so. We'll find ways to engage our Reservoir Hill neighbors. God willing, we'll have even more doors in spring when the office building is complete. And we'll kick it all off just 10 days from now. At Ne'ilah, before we leave for breakfast, many of you know that we have a tradition of taking a potted plant from our front steps and leaving it on a neighbor's stoop. This year, we'll also take a brief moment, because I know you'll be hungry, to hang 2 mezuzot on our Utah Place door frames. The third we'll hold on to for now. There's an old tradition of leaving a part of a newly stuccoed home bare until the temple in Jerusalem is rebuilt. Interestingly, Rav Chisda suggests that this unfinished square must be by the door. In our case, I suggest we acknowledge the process of coming home and the trauma we still bear by leaving one door without a mezuzah for now. My prayer is that by next High Holy Days, we'll feel sufficiently recovered that we can, at Ne'ilah 5783, hang that final mezuzah and complete our re-entry. But no matter what, let's remember Beth Am has thrived for nearly 50 years. Our building has stood for nearly 100. Our people have flourished for millennia. Sure, we may at times be disappointed, and rightly so. But together, we can still make this year sweeter, healthier, and holier. Shana Tova.